area. So Harry's been working and studying in the area of psychotherapy for nearly 2 decades, specialised in the areas of eating disorders. After her psychology degree, Harriet completed an MA in addiction studies and then an MSc in psychoanalytic psychotherapy at St. Vincent's Hospital. Harriet has been working for Bodywise, the Eating Disorder Association, since 2004. And Harriet frequently lectures and trains students and professionals in the areas of eating disorders, treatment, support, and provision. She's lectured on psychoanalysis and eating disorders in UCD, Trinity, and the Business School of Dublin. And she's a member of the ICP, a registered practitioner with the APPI, and she served on the scientific committee of the executive committee and was chair of the organization from 2014 to 2016. This bit I didn't know.
Did I send that to you?
No, you didn't. I found this out. Harriet is a ballerina, trained in Russia, then danced at the Moscow City Ballet before pursuing her current career. And then to make it even more embarrassing, I was doing a radio interview with Near FM about 2 weeks ago, and about this event coming up. And the presenter said, I was reading through the events and you see, you've Harriet Parsons coming on. I went, indeed, we do. We're very lucky to have her. And he says, when you do her, will you tell her, my name is Michael Sullivan, and I carried her from O'Connell Street up to the Abbey about 20 years ago on his shoulders.
Around 45 years ago, 42 years ago, maybe. I was about 3, I'd say.
Generous. He said, make sure you tell her.
Thanks, Ken, thanks. Yeah.
But just before we get into the talk, I say your talk is on ADHD and eating disorders. It's an area that is beginning to get a bit more traction. And I say in our earlier talks this afternoon, both Amanda Kirby and Nicola Koss certainly touched on that as an area that was coming up. So we're really looking forward to hearing what will be for a lot of us new information.
Great. Okay. Well, and Emma was amazing at just being so succinct. I'm not like that. So I'm going to, and my slides are quite busy. So I'm just going to pick out the main points, but I will have the slides available afterwards for people so they can read the information on them. And thank you all for asking me to present something on eating disorders and ADHD. And I suppose, you know, I would know a lot about eating disorders and I didn't know a lot about ADHD. So I have had to learn a lot to prepare for today. So I hope that it hits the mark and I hope that you find it interesting. I certainly did. So I thought, you know, listening earlier and listening to Emma just now and listening to Ned earlier, the way I suppose I think about eating disorders is kind of similar to the way that they've been describing ADHD, in that there are different aspects of it. It affects kind of every aspect of how a person functions. And this is how we you know, would think about eating disorders as well, that there's the behavioral part. So there's the disordered eating behaviors, so that's like not eating or binge eating or over exercising or purging. There's the cognitive part, so there's the part that where the person's thinking becomes distorted because of the eating disorder, so they start to have distorted eating disorder thoughts, like I can't eat that, it'll make me fat, or if I eat that I have to run, whatever. So there's the cognitive part. There's the physical part, which is basically that if you're not eating properly, you know, physically you suffer. So if you aren't eating enough, you'll lose weight, or if you're binge eating, you'll put on weight, and there's symptoms associated with that. And then there's the very important emotional part, and I suppose Emma's analogy of the iceberg is a similar analogy that's used a lot in eating disorders, that what we see at the surface is the behavioral part, and that the cognitive, the physical, the emotional part, we see the physical part as well, but all the others, the bigger, more complicated part is under the surface, and that's where we have that emotional part as well. So they're similar in that way. I suppose with an eating disorder, you know, it's a mental health condition, it's life-threatening, you know, people can get seriously ill, and for that reason we need to take them seriously. And I suppose then thinking about where we link with ADHD is that, you know, if somebody has a serious eating disorder that they are finding really difficult to get out of, and as we'll come to see when I looked through the research in terms of where that crossover is, it actually is really important if there's something else like ADHD going on, because the characteristics of that, like the impulsivity or the the things, I suppose I was so struck earlier when Ned was describing those kind of characteristics can feed in, sorry for pardon the pun, into the eating disorder and make eating disorder recovery even more difficult. That it's not just about changing that there's something in the person's personality that is contributing to what's going on. And I suppose when we think of those four aspects, we don't think that one leads to the other, that they kind of work in a loop, that they're all influencing each other, and that's what makes it so very difficult. Essentially, I suppose also when you're thinking about an eating disorder, while you think it's about food, it's not about food. Food is only that tip of the iceberg, and really if you just focus on the food part and the eating part, you're kind of missing the point. And I'm sure that you would all agree around ADHD that if you just focus on, say, that somebody, disruptive behavior in a classroom, you're missing the point. There's a lot of other stuff going on there. And what we would say about eating disorders is that they are coping mechanisms. So the person does the disordered eating behavior because in some way it helps them to function. It helps them to manage anxiety. It helps them to manage how they're feeling. And I suppose in some ways that's what we're hearing as well, that is happening, when a person has been diagnosed with ADHD as well, that's what, that they're doing they're exhibiting all of these behaviors for a reason, that it's achieving something for them. It's managing something. So they're like an eating disorder, a functional illness. Okay, and I suppose because we would say an eating disorder has a function, that's what makes it really hard for people to give it up or to change. And so when you're trying to work with somebody with an eating disorder, resistance is normal, that they find it very, very difficult to recover. But we have to remember that full recovery is possible. And as we can see in a minute, for full recovery in some instances, it is important that we think about how sometimes ADHD characteristics are influencing how a person recovers. So when I say eating disorder, I'm talking about anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. And then there are these other specified eating disorders that don't necessarily fit in neatly into those categories. And I'm going to go through them all because there are certain characteristics in them that are where ADHD crosses over with them. So bear with me for a minute while I just go through. What I want to say at the beginning is that when we're thinking about eating disorders, we take this kind of it's called the transdiagnostic perspective. And it means that all of the eating disorders have far more in common with each other than different, but they differ in terms of the disordered eating behaviors. Yeah, and they differ in terms of the person's weight, but they're very similar in terms of the psychological symptoms, the thinking style, the person's sense of self in the world, the way they think and the way they experience themselves in the world and the world. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly, so I'm really keeping an eye on time. So with anorexia, we know we have a persistent restriction of energy intake. So not eating enough food, leading to significantly underweight, a disturbance with regard to body weight and shape, and an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat. So that becomes a thought. And actually, when Ned was talking earlier about that ruminating behavior, about that tendency to catastrophize and to feel like I'm the worst person in the world, actually, that's kind of the voice that people hear in an eating disorder when they think that they're the worst person in the world, when they think they can't do anything, when they think that, that they're not good enough or they've no self-worth. That's kind of the same. They have the same thoughts as what he was describing earlier, which I thought was interesting. Now, bulimia has repeated episodes of binge eating, and during the binge eating episodes, there's a lack of control over eating. Okay, so a sense of a lack of control over eating. Inappropriate compensatory behaviors, so that's purging or over-exercising, the same kind of body shape and weight distortion. And it's really not obvious because the person is usually eating quite normally and only purging afterwards. They often have normal weight, so we don't notice that they have an eating disorder. So it often goes on for a long time before we notice that they have an eating disorder. And then binge eating disorder. We have repeated episodes of binge eating, which has a sense of lack of control over eating during the episode, but they don't engage in the compensatory behaviors. So a person with binge eating disorder will put on weight. So they will either be in the overweight or the obese category of weight. And I'll just say it, obesity is not an eating disorder. Obesity is just a weight classification. It's not telling us anything else. Now you can see there, I have underlined certain words, okay, in bulimia and binge eating disorder, because these are the points that in the research ADHD crosses over with eating disorders. I just wanted to put in a slide there around risk factors, because some of the risk factors for an eating disorder there are also present when we look at somebody who has a diagnosis of ADHD, okay? And we'll see that when I come to the research. So quickly then, and Ken, stop me if I'm going on too long. Quickly, if we're introducing ADHD into this conversation about eating disorders, what I have found is that several studies have shown that those diagnosed with ADHD are more likely to experience an eating disorder or eating disorder psychopathology. And within that, are more likely to develop bulimia and binge eating disorder than a restrictive eating disorder. So that's why I drew your attention to bulimia and binge eating disorder. So let's just quickly look at what's being said. Now, these slides, as I say, are very busy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but you can have them afterwards. So the first thing, one of the research studies shows that those who have clinical ADHD are more likely to experience clinical eating disorder. Clinical level, again, binging and purging behaviors, and clinical level restrictive behaviors. And as expected, those with a subclinical ADHD, okay, both with inattentive and hyperactive or impulsive characteristics, are more likely to experience subclinical binging or purging behaviors, but not subclinical restrictive behaviors. In line with that, another study in 2013 showed that ADHD symptoms level was similar in bulimia, eating disorders not otherwise specified, and binge eating subtypes, and lower in anorexic patients. So this is a pattern that we're seeing. Binging and purging eating disorder subtypes have a high ADHD symptom level, are also related with more severe eating, general and personality psychopathology. Sorry, I just need to move this out of the way. There. Okay, so this study also found that ADHD symptom levels in eating disorder patients differs between subtypes. Okay, so the results showed a high frequency of ADHD symptomatology in eating disorder patients. And in line with other research, it showed that the more impulsive groups, so that's eating disorder impulsive groups like bulimia, binge eating disorder, and the other specified subtypes, presented with higher ADHD symptom levels compared to the restrictive anorexic group, okay? The underlying reduced impulse control, which is a common characteristic in the binging eating disorder subtypes, again, is a shared characteristic with the ADHD population, okay? And they say that that could be due to genetic risk factors. Okay, so there's some other studies there. I'm just going to click on because of time. So what does this really mean, I suppose? What I have found is that really the research into the two is really sparse, and the results are varied, although there would seem to be this link between ADHD and the more impulsive eating disorders where you have binge eating. So that would be bulimia and binge eating disorder, okay? Certain characteristics there, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and attention deficit are key aspects that are identified in some eating disorders more than others. The consequences for treatment and how to support someone are what is really important here. And I suppose for us, trying to identify whether a characteristic is core to the eating disorder or is as a result of what the person has been diagnosed with before, and how that person is then going to be treated. Okay, so in terms of treatment, I found a study from 2018 that said that a high degree of ADHD symptoms at baseline was predictive for non-recovery of an eating disorder at 1 year follow-up. Okay, so and the presence of inattentive ADHD symptoms was stronger associated with non-recovery than hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. Okay. So what that really means is that as clinicians, we have to take account of ADHD psychopathology when we're dealing with those more impulsive eating disorders in terms of those characteristics. And I suppose for the families that we're trying to support, I'm thinking of it from that perspective. You know, how can that help families support somebody? And I suppose families have to learn, what I'm hearing from Emma and from Ned earlier, is that families have to learn how to help their person to have impulse control, to be able to self-regulate, to be able to have that emotional regulation, and learning all of those things can only help somebody who has an eating disorder. You know, that's really what we're trying to do when we're trying to support somebody with an eating disorder. And I have there at the bottom, you know, the key aspect to eating disorder recovery is regular eating, the rule of 3, eating regularly. You know, it regularizes how we feel, it regularizes our digestive system, and it helps us feel kind of grounded in the world as well. So I hope that that's helpful, Ken.
I have to turn my mute button off there. So thank you very much. Now it is really, really important. You know, it's new information that's out there that we haven't seen before. So I really appreciate taking the time to put that together for us. But just to pick up on one of the things that you did say there,
Yes.
ADHD, obesity is not an eating disorder.
Yes.
It is separate. So what we're doing now is we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Finian Fallon, and he's going to do ADHD diagnosis. So perhaps we'll do the questions after the 2 of those sessions together and take them together again. So thank you very much for that, Harriet.